Good afternoon and welcome to WIDA's third annual Washington International Trade Conference, our first one taking place fully online. We have a packed schedule today and tomorrow, and we're thrilled that you are all here today. Before we get to today's program, a few notes for everyone. Each session runs approximately 55 minutes. We'll try to have a short break at the end of each session, but we'll leave the Zoom room active. If you need to log out and come back in, your link for today should serve to readmit you back into the conference. If you have a problem connecting otherwise, you can also view the conference on WIDA's YouTube page. During each session, we'll try to get to audience questions in the last 10 or 15 minutes. Please use the Q&A tab on Zoom, and you can submit questions as we go. If you're having any problems, as I mentioned on your feed, you can watch on our YouTube channel. You can also email us at events@wida.org, and our team can try to help you solve your connection problems. Over the past 11 months, we've hosted over 60 webinar panels with over 9,000 viewers, and today we're pleased to be joined by nearly 400 people in 23 states and 27 different countries. I want to say a special thanks to our sponsors whose names were scrolling just a moment ago. Their generous support is essential to our mission to bring the trade community together for high quality, high impact discussion of US and international trade policy. Thank you to all of them, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. If you've been at our sessions before, you know we like to call out the names of some people who we are in community with at today's event, even if you can't see them. If I have time, I'll try to call out people before each of the sessions starts. So we're pleased to welcome today Stephanie Agee from the Virginia Economic Development Partnership, who is one of today's sponsors. My good friend, Deanna Oken at Odusi, Mastriani and Schaumburg, who is also another one of our sponsors today. Grant Aldonis, who many of you know, and Melissa Nelson at Sanmar Corporation, coming to us from outside of Seattle. Thank you all for joining us today. And of course, a big welcome back to my good friend and partner in all of this, Wendy Cutler, the Asia Society Policy Institute. She will be moderating our kickoff panel today on US-China Relations. Wendy, you have been a great partner in many of those 60 webinars, and I'm so grateful you can join us today. Welcome to Ambassador Kurt Tong, who was with us at our 2020 conference, and to Susan Shirk and Aaron Friedberg, who are both new to the WIDA platform, coming to us today from San Diego in Susan's case and Princeton, New Jersey for Aaron. Thank you to both of you for joining us. China is, as everyone knows, front and center for US foreign policy, security policy, and trade policy. And we couldn't be more pleased than to bring together this fantastic panel to help us get a handle on our multifaceted relationship with the world's most populous country, and to help us better understand some of the larger issues that impact on our trade agenda. Wendy?
Well, thanks, Ken, and welcome everyone. It's really my pleasure to kick off this two-day WIDA conference. Before I get to today's panel, I just wanted to make a special shout out for Ken Diego and his team. Through all of these webinars over the past year, they've really kept the trade community connected while bringing forth interesting issues, interesting topics, providing different perspectives on issues that many of us are working on and discussing. So thanks, Ken, and I look forward to listening in on the rest of the program over the next 2 days. As Ken mentioned, we're going to start with China, and there couldn't be a more pressing and timely topic to discuss at the WIDA conference. This is the most consequential relationship we have with any country now, and is likely to be so for the rest of the century. Now, typically at WIDA events, when we say we're doing China, we have a panel that can discuss, should we keep the tariffs? Is phase 1 implementation going smoothly? What should we do with the phase 2 issues? But we're going to do something different this afternoon. And that is, we're going to discuss the overall US-China relationship and how trade fits into this larger picture. And to do so, we couldn't have 3 better panelists who bring years of experience both in government, academia, and the private sector to this discussion. And so I am thrilled to moderate a panel with Kurt Tong, Susan Shirk, and Aaron Friedberg. So let's get right to the questions now. The last 20 minutes or so, we'll be taking questions from the audience, so please use that Q&A function. So let's start and talk about how trade fits into the overall US-China relationship. Now, over the Trump administration, trade was kind of front and center in our overall agenda with China. I think we all agree that's going to change going forward, and the Biden team is going to develop an overall strategy on our China policy, which will include trade, but not necessarily be dominated by trade. So I would welcome the views of our panelists, and I'll start with Susan, to just give us your sense of where you think the overall US-China relationship is, how the Biden review will be conducted, and where trade might fit in this overall policy, keeping in mind that obviously trade overlaps with other issues that will be addressed in this review, like technology and human rights. Over to you, Susan. Thank you. Are you on mute?
Yep. Well, wonderful to be here with such a great group of colleagues. Thanks so much for the opportunity. As you say, trade is not going to be central to Biden administration's strategy toward China, but I think technology is more likely to be at the center. Of course, US-China relations have deteriorated significantly over the past 4 or 5 years, even though this really started long before Trump and even long before Xi Jinping. But now technology has really become focus of the strategic rivalry between the United States and China. Because the technology issues really combine security, economic competitiveness, and human rights as well. Surveillance has really come to the fore as one of the most significant problems that we have with China's practices, especially in Xinjiang, but not limited to Xinjiang. So, but trade remains very important because the fact of the matter is that the Chinese government is, you can see right now in its initiatives with Asia and Europe on trade, and saying a lot of nice words at Davos about being open to all businesses, that they would like to have the world become very dependent upon them while they pursue a strategy of reducing their dependence on the rest of the world. And that's definitely what the dual circulation policy is about. So really, we cannot compete effectively with China without a trade policy and some trade initiatives. But that's really because that's what enables us to work with other countries in enhancing our leverage on China and also in strengthening our own economy. But then the problem is, how do you do that in the current domestic politics? The Biden administration has so many other domestic priorities. Are they really going to expend the political capital they would need to try to promote trade agreements? I'll leave it there.
Well, thanks for that. Aaron, maybe I can turn to you then. Where are the security issues going to fit in this review, particularly given the assertive China we're seeing in the South China Sea, in Taiwan, elsewhere around the world? Interested in your comments.
Okay, thank you very much, Wendy. First, just a couple of quick thoughts about where we are, where we've been. It took them some time to do it, and perhaps they didn't do it as well as they might have. But the Trump administration, in the end, did offer a kind of diagnosis of the problem, the challenge from China, and a prescription for dealing with it. The diagnosis essentially was that China is a systemic rival, as the EU referred to it. So it's a challenge in the security domain, economics, technology, political interference, and so on, and ideology. And the administration's response was basically to push back or try to push back in all of those different dimensions. And now the Biden administration, at least judging by the initial comments from the President, the Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, seems to largely accept the diagnosis of the previous administration, and they've said as much. And the question, I think, is how are they going to modify the prescription? How are they going to change what we're doing? Are they going to add in certain dimensions? Are they going to keep certain things the same? Are they going to subtract and take away? I think you asked about the strategic dimension. In a way, that is ongoing. I see less change there than in some other areas. The challenge of maintaining a favorable balance of power in the Asia Pacific region persists and is going to get more intense. But if you look across these other domains, I agree with Susan. I think technology is going to be central. The new administration is going to have to make some decisions about, for example, about export control regulations. There's a protective half of the technology portfolio. But I think also there's a question of how exactly they want to try to promote the development of technology in the United States. To what extent are they going to engage in industrial policy and so on? So I think that's an area where we're going to see some change, but more similar than different. An area where I think there will be perhaps the biggest change from the previous administration is going to be human rights. And I hope we'll have a chance to talk about that, because I think that is going to be really central, and central also to US relations with other democratic countries as we try to agree on some approach to China. Trade, as you say, is not going to be central, but it isn't going to go away either. It can't, obviously, as an issue. In a way, the last 4 years have been kind of an experiment. The Trump administration tried to accomplish with sort of unilateral pressure what previous US administrations have tried to accomplish working through the WTO, through multilateral mechanisms. I don't think it's too harsh to say that it didn't work. But the problem remains, the problem of Chinese industrial policy, subsidies, theft of intellectual property, technology promotion policy. And the question is what exactly we're going to do about it. Indeed, as Susan suggests, in certain respects, Xi Jinping has doubled down on the previous policies. Just two practical issues just to close. One, I think the new administration is going to have to make some decisions about what to do regarding the tariffs that have been imposed, particularly those justified with reference to Section 301. And those are substantial. And I think many people would agree that the rationale for them is a serious one. And then the other question, or one other question, is going to be what exactly to do about the WTO and whether to repair it, to work through it, work around it. So trade is going to be important, even if it's not as central as it was to the previous administration.
So Kurt, I'd be interested in your perspective on this review and how the different agencies are going to deal with all of these different issues of technology, security, trade, ideology. How are they going to sort through that? And maybe just given your long time experience in different administrations and through transitions and having participated in these such reviews before, how do they actually work, and what do you think the time frame is? Easy questions.
Yeah, easy questions, Wendy. Thanks. The time frame is going to be long. Okay, that was an easy one. It's going to take really long time. Let me play Venn diagram with you for a second, because I'm here in Washington. I wish I was at Princeton at my alma mater or in San Diego. It looks very nice where Susan is, but we're in Washington. It's a Washington thing. So we got two beasts here. We got the national security crowd and we got trade crowd. And these two groups, I don't think actually know each other personally or substantively to an interesting extent. National security crowd has been out saying what they think. And President and Blinken and Sullivan have been outlining their view on China quite clearly without ever mentioning trade, or not. I mean, they might have said the word trade, but there's no clear enunciation of what they think. National security crowd has been quite clear. It's technology, keeping China behind technologically on key items that are militarily significant. Security, not giving up an inch to China in terms of our power projection in the Western Pacific and maintenance of stability in the region. And now, as Aaron said, democracy getting a real emphasis, the US being strong and proud about being a democracy and pointing out the flaws of China. That's their point number one. Point number two is they say that they're going to confront China, cooperate with China, and negotiate with China. But they haven't said what they're going to negotiate on. And the point number three is that they want to kind of put China on pause and talk to allies first. So that's the national security crowd. They've been quite clear. The trade people, we have a trade policy for the middle class. What does that mean? It presumably means that the idea of going back into TPP or other forms of major positive leverage initiatives with friends and allies might be off the table for the time being. But the question mark, I honestly don't know. Does it mean that there will actually be pursuit of market opening in China when marketing opening in China is complicated, right? There are pros and cons. It's hard to get a good deal. President Trump threw everything but the kitchen sink in and didn't get that much out. Should they actually emphasize market opening? Or is it just, and this might finally get to my point, working on where these two groups intersect, which is on ameliorating the negative impact of China's rise, export control issues, digital economy issues, subsidy issues in the WTO or bilaterally, and creating coalitions of the willing on those issues. That's not a particularly ambitious trade agenda in an overall sense, but that may be what we're looking at for China, is where the national security crowd and the trade crowd intersect.
Interesting. And of course, you know, a lot of the national security team is already in office, while on the trade side, we're still waiting for confirmation of a number of the key appointees, including Catherine Tai. Susan, Kurt said something interesting, and that was, in his view, this review is going to take time. And at the same time, China's not standing still. And over the past few months, we've seen RCEP signed, including China. We've seen the China-EU investment deal being agreed to in principle. And we now hear China talking about reviving the trilateral negotiations with Japan and Korea and possibly joining CPTPP. How does this work? Can it work if the United States is busy reviewing and working internally and China is moving on during that time period?
Well, China's moving on in ways that are tactically quite smart to put a wedge between the United States and its allies, because we've announced that a major focus of the Biden administration is to restore our relationship with our allies and friends, and that in effect, we're saying we recognize that we don't have the leverage we once had, and so we need to work together with other countries in order to influence China's choices and its behavior. So, you know, some of the things that China's doing to reassure other countries that it's not a threat, that it is happy to cooperate economically, commercially, even saying that China would be willing to move toward joining the new version of TPP. Actually, these things are not negative things. I mean, they may be tactically negative, but if they actually result in some actions, domestic actions inside China that create more of a level playing field for international companies, that's a good thing. So we certainly shouldn't stand on the sidelines whining about this. That would be very unseemly. But of course, we need to move as quickly as we can so that we show some early tangible ways that we are cooperating with our allies too. And this morning on another phone call, I just heard Evan Medeiros suggest that, cooperation on Myanmar situation with other Southeast Asian countries, for example, or Asia would, it's orthogonal to the US-China relationship, but we need to show that we are working well with our allies at the same time as China is moving forward so actively.
Aaron, to pick up on something you said earlier, you raised the issue of the tariffs, and they're going to have to be reviewed, in the context of this overall review. But can I ask you, from a Chinese perspective, do they really care about these tariffs anymore? Are they actual leverage, or has China kind of figured out how to work around these tariffs? This is part of the new world, and we're kind of fooling ourselves thinking that we have a lot of leverage.
Well, the results would suggest that we don't have as much leverage as we thought we did when we imposed these, and went quite far in imposing tariffs on imports from China. It doesn't really seem to have budged the Chinese position, or not very much. I mean, the phase one agreement, I don't think really in the end is going to amount to very much. And it certainly didn't address the underlying sort of structural issues that were initially targeted, again, especially under the 301 tariffs. I think the thing that China has responded to more and is more concerned about are the export control regulations. Obviously, that, particularly in the semiconductor area, that's something that turned out to hit them very hard. I think one of the things that's been revealed, both to us and perhaps to them, although they probably were aware of it, was the extent to which they continue to be dependent on the West, on the United States, for certain critical technologies. And the semiconductor example is a crucial one. That, I think, is their biggest concern. And they're responding to it in two ways. One, as part of the whole dual circulation strategy and emphasizing the domestic half of their economic policy, they're pushing even harder for so-called self-reliance, technological self-reliance. And that's something that's been underway for a while, but I think it's gotten a boost because of the recognition of the extent of China's vulnerability, and also of the willingness of the United States to exploit that. That was something that just wasn't on the table until the Trump administration started to use it. So that's one part. The other piece of their strategy, and maybe this has two prongs itself. One is, I think, to try to get the United States and the new administration to back away from those export control restrictions. And there will be pressure on the new administration. There already is, from some industry groups, to not overdo it, and arguments about the costs that this may impose on American industry and the advantage it may give to competitors of American companies. So they're going to try to work that. And then also they're going to try as best they can to make sure that the United States and a relatively small group of countries that also have these high-end critical technologies don't get together and cooperate. And I think the biggest fear that the CCP has across all domains, but maybe especially in this one, is what Xi Jinping referred to as exclusive small circles of democratic countries, or one of their commentators referred to this as fake multilateralism. I think the thing they worry about most is the prospect of closer cooperation between the United States and a relatively small group of the most advanced democratic countries, in particular in the technology domain. And they would like very much to prevent that from happening. It's not clear to me whether they'll be able to do that.
Yeah, picking up on that, in the same speech that Xi Jinping referred to these small circles, he also emphasized the need for multilateralism. And he talked about working through groupings like the G20 in a very active manner. But he also didn't mention some other key organizations like the IMF or the World Bank. So Kurt, over to you. The Biden administration has put an emphasis not only working with allies and partners, but also working through international institutions and groupings. But we've kind of been out of that game for the past 4 years. Is it too late, or can the United States really up its game in these organizations, influence them, and play an active and constructive role?
I don't think it's too late. I'm amused by the use of the word fake multilateralism, because now fake has now come to mean anything you don't like. So fake news is news you don't like. Fake multilateralism is multilateralism you don't like. I think the more mission driven and focused an international organization is, the better suited it is to US needs. So IMF and World Bank actually, I would think, would register quite high in terms of being utilitarian from US perspective, because they've got a specific mandate, specific rules, and those reinforce the so-called Washington consensus about how the world should be organized. The G20 is very flexible. China's a member, so they probably like the G20 because they can tie it up in knots and make sure that it doesn't accomplish anything. WTO is a really important one, right? Can the US get back in the game there and help make that organization actually address the challenge of heavily subsidized state-run business, which is a central concern to a lot of countries, but China's going to be in there working hard to make sure that nothing happens. And I think that's going to be a critical, just absolutely critical battleground, one that I know that the WTO is going to be super focused on.
So Aaron, I'm going to turn to you now on human rights issues. We have a number of viewers' questions on the human rights issue. And I think you had mentioned early on that this was going to be kind of a key feature of the Biden overall policy towards China. So can you offer your views on how we should approach these human rights issues, whether in Hong Kong, Xinjiang, or elsewhere? And also, does this complicate our ability to work with certain allies and partners?
Well, I think in a way, the human rights framing is, I think, outdated. It's language that we used, say, back in the 90s, when the issue was the treatment of relatively small number of political prisoners. And the expectation was that general conditions in China would improve over time and human rights issues would tend to dwindle in importance. It seems to me now that what we're really talking about is the nature of the CCP system, that human rights violations are a symptom, but there's a deeper problem, which is the Leninist centralized authoritarian regime. And of course, the problems in the human rights domain are now so visible and so much larger, and thinking particularly of the treatment of the Uyghur minority population and the construction of concentration camps and all of the horrendous stories that keep coming out about that. These are not just minor, easily manageable problems. Moreover, I think the CCP thus far has given absolutely no indication, not only that they intend to change direction in this regard, but they're almost not, they don't seem embarrassed by these revelations. They insist on saying that this is re-education, and they think somehow that sounds benign to Western ears, when obviously it doesn't. So I think the issue is much bigger and become bigger and more apparent. And that leaves the question of how exactly to deal with it. I'm not optimistic about the ability of the United States or even a more cohesive grouping of democratic countries to apply pressure that would cause the regime to change in fundamental ways the way in which it manages its domestic population. Obviously, that's a deep concern to them, and they're going to do whatever they think they need to do to maintain control. So then where does that leave us? I think just coming back to the Uyghur issue, and the reason that I suggested a few minutes ago that I thought the human rights was going to be front and center, or could well be front and center in the new administration, not only because they're saying it, but there's a very pressing question about the Olympics coming up within a year. Are we really going to send Americans to participate in Olympic Games in a country that is so visibly mistreating a significant minority in its population? Can we get others to agree to boycott the Olympics? I gather that some people in the new administration have been talking quietly to some of our allies and partners. Is that desirable? What would it accomplish? But I think that question is going to force a discussion of all of this. You asked just finally about the implications for our ability to cooperate with our friends and allies on this. I actually think that the way in which the human rights issue has become so visible and the way in which it's grown, along with some other developments of the last couple of years, have shifted opinion, particularly in Europe, regarding China very dramatically. And in a way, the top level political leaders in the major countries there don't seem to have caught up with these shifts in opinion, which now are very negative towards China. And I think a lot of that's driven by human rights concerns. So actually, these problems present an opportunity for the United States, for an administration that wants to focus on these issues, to make common cause with countries that share these same values and are appalled as we are by what we see.
Susan, maybe I can follow up on that point that Aaron just raised, because yeah, when it comes to Europe, I think I would agree with you. And frankly, the European Parliament has been, certain members have been very vocal about their concerns about the provisions of the new investment deal with respect to ILO conventions on forced labor. But when I talk to my Asian friends, one of the things they do raise, or they ask me, how is the new administration going to deal with human rights issues? What are they going to be asking us to do? And I think, frankly, building a coalition of like-minded countries is going to have enormous challenges. It's something we absolutely need to be doing, but I would argue we need to be very realistic and clear-eyed with respect to our expectations. But does the human rights issue complicate our ability to build coalitions, particularly with other Asian partners? Susan, I'd be interested in your views.
When people nowadays are really very pessimistic about the possibility of inducing China to change its negative behavior, which is detrimental to our interests and our values. I mean, basically, the Trump administration was acting as if it had totally given up on any possibility of inducing even marginal modifications in Chinese policies. I guess the way I put it is I haven't completely given up on China from this respect. And one of the reasons is that Chinese leadership, even Xi Jinping, remains acutely sensitive to its reputation globally. that really cares about the reputation and does not want to be viewed as just a bigger, more powerful rogue state. And they invest a tremendous amount of energy in trying to get other countries to say positive things about their policy, and including their domestic policy. So they really do care about their reputation. So I am quite pessimistic, as Aaron is, as he said too, that we've never really found tangible ways of changing China's human rights policies to make it less repressive, because it's a communist autocratic state and it's become increasingly dictatorial under Xi Jinping. But on the other hand, this moral, reputational condemnation is worth something. I'm not, my expectations aren't hugely high that China's going to change its practices, but it's conceivable that at the margin, we can get a little bit of improvement. We could get International Committee of the Red Cross inspecting things. We could, so I think this concern about its reputation is something to work with anyway.
Kurt, would you agree with Susan's assessment, and I don't want to say optimism, maybe a glimmer of optimism, that this is something that China cares about, their reputation internationally, and therefore maybe it offers us, talking like a negotiator, some leverage.
Yeah, I think they care about the reputation, but then they have a real difficulty figuring out how to defend their reputation and end up saying preposterous things in an attempt to defend that reputation. I think the framing of this as a bad governance issue as opposed to a human rights issue, that's step one, and I think that's important. And when you frame it that way, you realize that the leverage is not really the issue, because then you do give up on the ability of the United States or any other people outside of China to change China. If China changes, it'll change the way it always has when Chinese people change China, right? So if you accept that as the starting point, then as Susan is saying, the point is to then make clear to both Chinese people and non-Chinese people that we think their governance system is wrong or is bad, not as good as it could be, or whatever language you want to use, and then do that consistently and get others to join in. Because I think that the other question that you were driving at, the administration clearly wants to form coalitions of the willing on China-related issues that matter to the United States. I personally would much rather see US capital being devoted, political capital, being devoted to making common cause on technology questions or on security questions than on matters like, spending a whole lot of political capital trying to get people not to have their people go play sports in Beijing, right? Which is not going to have any impact on China. And so one of my concerns is that the democracy, human rights crowd, because they frame it as a democracy, human rights issue, always want to ask for the sky in terms of use of leverage when there's actually no prospect that that leverage would have the intended effect. So I'm hoping as we get it, and you asked about the policy review, that we get some kind of systematic sense about what the priorities are and what our asks are to our friends and allies, because they're not going to say yes to everything. And if you say no semiconductors, no Olympics, no this, no that, no that, then you're going to get into an endless debate. And it won't be China driving a wedge between us and our friends. It'll be our own inability to prioritize and reach agreement that'll be the problem.
It's like a targeted, well thought out list of topics to work with allies and partners, but also listening to them and their concerns and their priorities as well, I think is extremely important. Aaron, I know you wanted to weigh in on the discussion on human rights and governance.
Just a quick thought on that. and I agree with the first part of what Kurt said, but I'm not sure I agree with the second. In my view, the reason for placing emphasis on this question of governance is not so much to persuade the current CCP regime to change, because I don't think that that's very likely, at least not in the short run. It's both to continue to send the signal to people in China, to the extent that they're able to receive it, that people outside have concerns about how their government treats them. But it's also, I think, important as a way of trying to rally support from other democratic countries. And I understand that this is something that makes governments uncomfortable and they don't want to have to do things that might be costly. But at some point, we have to be willing to accept some costs if we're going to continue to apply pressure on this issue. So I think the reason for emphasizing it has more to do with other audiences than it does with the CCP.
So we have a question about climate change and maybe other issues of potential cooperation between the US and China. And maybe Susan, I'll start with you. Do you see issues like climate change as possible areas of cooperation? And will China in return want something from us? And does that lead to, is there any credence to concerns that the US, the Biden team, may end up trading things off in order to get things on climate change? That's a criticism we've heard, and I'd just be interested in your views. Is there any merit to that, or can an administration at the same time cooperate with a country or collaborate with a country, but also confront them and call them out when there are disagreements?
Well, I'd say John Kerry made very clear that that's what the Biden administration intends to do. That the kind of linkage that China might have anticipated in the past, forget about it. We're not going to be playing that game anymore. Now, having said that, we have to acknowledge that when you have, Madeleine Albright used to talk about US-China relations as this multifaceted relationship. It's become even more multifaceted than 20 years ago when she was Secretary of State. So, and making China policy is making decisions about trade-offs constantly. You have to be doing that. So, but I'd say the Biden administration intends not to link to climate cooperation because China is not doing it to do us a favor. They're doing it because it's in their own interests. And the problem is that oftentimes Chinese government defines its interests so narrowly. But we're going to try to induce them to define their interests more broadly so they overlap with our interests and the interests of the whole world in saving the planet. So I think you'll see a strong effort on climate, but it won't be linked to other issues.
Kurt, we got a question from the audience on communication, or actually lack of communication between Chinese officials and US officials, particularly during the Trump administration. And ironically, for the WIDA crowd, we used to talk about really the communication was happening, frankly, in the trade relationship, which seems so ironic. But you've participated in past dialogues, whether it be the SNED or the JCCT, and you've heard the Chinese in particular, they routinely call for more dialogue and the establishment of dialogues and how much they miss these dialogues. I mean, how important were these dialogues? Can they be is there a room for them in the relationship going forward? And kind of what improvements would need to be made? And also, I would just put out for you too, so far, there has not been a phone call between President Biden and Xi Jinping. I found it curious yesterday when Biden was asked the question in a recent interview, he said something along the lines of, there's no reason not to call him. Is this a signal that we may wake up one morning this week and hear that there has been a call between the two leaders?
Yeah, so that was kind of interesting. I thought it was like kind of like Joe Biden going, call me on TV. But yeah, I think there could be a call soon. It'll be a recitation of talking points by both sides, and not.
But is that good or bad?
It's fine. Yeah, it's good to do it. So I think that it's really important for each of the important people in the U.S. government to have a Chinese counterpart and to communicate regularly with that person, because clarity and intentions and communication is important, and you want to have they want us to understand what they're thinking, and we want them to understand what we're thinking. Don't want to like hide the football in this. But I think that and this is similar to what Susan was just saying. Is you don't want to create this idea that you're trading off progress on one area, like the area that we like, the good conversation with I guess China will start calling it like fake negotiations when they don't like it. And so I don't think we need to do these dialogues anymore. The SNED, the SCD, the whatever. The JCCT was relatively narrow and focused. Maybe that one could be restarted, but there should be regular communication. And you talked about the actual communication the Trump administration did was on trade. That was a negotiation communication, right? And through tariffs and through negotiated text. And I think that's fine to do that. Try and get what you can get. But given how I think low expectations are that we're going to have huge breakthroughs in bilateral negotiation with China, devoting a whole lot of attention to grand dialogues that just create an opportunity for China to obfuscate and create false trade-offs is not something I'd be excited about.
Aaron, where do you come out on these dialogues? Could they be structured in a way to make them more results-oriented, more meaningful, and contribute to the relationship?
Yes, I'm a dialogue skeptic. Not that I'm against it in theory, but if you look at how it's played out over time, I think in the U.S. government, the existence of these things then becomes the focal point for a lot of bureaucratic activity. We're preparing for the next SNED, therefore everybody who's concerned with this set of issues has to be focused on talking points. And even worse, there have been occasions on which responses to Chinese actions in other domains may have been slowed as a result of concerns about upsetting the apple cart and having a crisis on the eve of one of these negotiations. So I don't think that they've accomplished that much. They've more likely tied us up in knots. I think we've taken them perhaps more seriously than the Chinese side has. That said, communications is important. You don't want to be in a situation where you don't have any channels. But I think the most meaningful communication is going to be over specific issues, whether it's negotiations over trade or discussions of procedures to avoid incidents at sea in the South China Sea. There are plenty of things to talk about, but the more focused they are and the more practical the discussions, the more likely they are to be meaningful if they're going to produce any results.
Susan, what can you share on this?
Well, I agree that the kind of circus-like big dialogues don't make a lot of sense and waste a lot of people's valuable time. But I do believe that I mean, my hope for the Biden administration is that it's going to be quite practical at identifying a set of priority issues that it will engage with China on in the first couple of years, and that it will include negotiations as part of that effort, not just tweets, not just confrontation, not just working with allies on positive initiatives, which I agree are really, that's super important and has to happen in parallel. with the negotiations. But, you know, I don't think you can try to freeze out the Chinese government and not talk to them. And I think it's very risky. You'll be much better if you communicate. And then, as you know, as an academic who had the opportunity to serve in government, I learned from that experience how working with a good Chinese counterpart who's candid with you, honest with you, in the end, the two of you are kind of working together to solve a problem. You're still very staunch defender of your national interests, but you're working together to solve the problem. And, you know, it doesn't always work with China. Probably it works less than half the time, but there are times that it does work. And then you make progress, and then that builds a certain comfort level, dare I say, even a little element of trust, and then you can move on to other issues.
And indeed, I think we saw that between Ambassador Lighthizer and Li He, who, you know, as Kurt mentioned, yeah, they negotiated together. But what I thought was fascinating was even once the deal came into effect, they kept up those communications and both became kind of ardent defenders of the deal within their respective governments. And you know, when Trump or others wanted to call out this agreement maybe is not working, you know, they were pretty vocal about pointing to all of the successes. We have probably our last question we'll take, and that's kind of the role of the business community in all of this. I'm sure we have a lot of viewers from different companies and trade associations watching this event today. I mean, at one time, the US business community really had a lot of influence on the US-China relationship and was instrumental in getting PNTR through Congress. Now, particularly under the Trump administration, the influence of the business community, I think, really diminished, particularly when it came to China. And in many respects, I think the Trump administration viewed the business community as one of the root causes of the problems we have with China today, at least on the economic front. So, you know, looking at the Biden administration and the focus on a kind of a worker-oriented trade policy, how do you assess the role of business going forward? Will they be playing an influential role on trade or technology or climate? I'd be interested in the views of the panel here. Kurt, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think that frankly, the relationship between business community and the administration broke down towards the end of the Trump administration, and that needs to be rebuilt. And there's a couple things that I think are most important. One is for the business community to figure out how to put into the trade policy for the middle class language the fact that making stuff in the United States and selling it to China creates jobs. And in some instances, investing in China creates US jobs. And frame it so that there is some, I guess, almost top cover for the idea that having a large trade and investment relationship with China as a proposition is not a bad thing for the US, because there is discussion out there that our goal should be decoupling from the world's largest economy, or second largest, depending on how you count it. And that would be a foolhardy thing for the US to do. The second thing that the business community can do is provide very specific information about specific policies, so that when the administration is trying to figure out how to maintain this technology gap with China, the business community can say, well, this is an important technology, this one not so much. This is how big the gap needs to be, and this is how we maintain that in very specific terms, so that you don't have these kind of big swings and misses like, you know, the silly TikTok thing and other kind of goofy policies coming down, and instead have it be more focused on the real concerns.
Aaron, do you agree with Kurt? Do you think the business community, particularly in the technology area, which you have emphasized, could play a really useful role in helping the administration kind of sort through the technologies that are really key to protect versus others that we shouldn't be restricting. Over to you.
Yes. I guess the first thing to note is, of course, there is no single business community. There never was, but there was a pretty strong component that favored good relations with China, favored engagement for quite some time. What's interesting is to see how that's fragmented and how the interests of the different subgroups have shifted, so that some of them are much less enthusiastic and or even concerned about what China is doing in a way that they might not have been 10 or 15 years ago. I do agree that it's critical to enlist the business community, certainly critical to listen to what people have to say, understand how it is that they're calibrating their own interests, try to adjust policies in ways that support them when their interests coincide with some conception of a larger national interest. And that's the final point I would make. I think we've gone a long way, assuming in effect that what was good for GM was good for the United States of America, or what was good for Apple was good for the United States of America, and that our national policy was sort of the aggregate of the interests of all these different groups. If that was ever true, it is no longer true. And I think one of the things that we have to face up to, and it's difficult to do, is that we have to have some conception, or the new administration has to have some conception of what is in the nation's interest, and be willing in some cases to impose costs or to take steps that will impose costs on particular groups, because some of this is going to be painful. You want to minimize that, you want to maximize the support you get, but we're not going to be able to have an effective policy for dealing with China in this domain and make everybody happy.
Susan, just the last question to you. As the Biden administration talks about working with allies and partners, do you think the business communities from different countries should also be working together to see how they could kind of contribute to this effort?
Well, I think that's a good idea, especially because one of the things we want to do with allies and friends is develop a kind of common approach on the technology issues, on the review of Chinese investment in tech sectors, and maybe not so much export controls, but certainly as the review of tech investment. So having that kind of communication among businesses from different countries, I think, is a good idea.
Well, with that, a big thanks to our panel today, Kurt, Susan, and Aaron. I think we just touched on many of the topics that could really merit a much deeper discussion, but I really want to thank you for helping us to understand how trade fits into the larger overall US-China relationship. So viewers and everyone, thank you so much to the panel for joining